Hello, my dear friends. There were Victorian women who broke things just because the doctor stopped treatment. Some burst into tears in the middle of the clinic. Some wrote thank you letters several pages long, as if it were the greatest love of their lives. Orgasm was no longer a private matter. It became a way of healing, a need, something they waited for every week. They didn't say it, but they still invited each other to the clinic, still sat quietly waiting for their turn. A secret group was born. Wooden boxes hid their own equipment, and ink-soaked letters were passed around. Tonight, you will hear every real detail about how orgasm turned Victorian women into people who could no longer control themselves. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now I dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If there was one rule that defined Victorian womanhood, it was the absolute silence surrounding sexuality. From the moment a girl began her transition into adulthood, she was warned to guard her modesty, to hide her body, and to never speak of desire. Any suggestion that she might possess curiosity about herself was met with disapproval. A woman's value was measured not by her mind or health, but by her ability to embody chastity in every gesture. Yet in the same society that demanded this silence, doctors created an entirely new category of illness that gave them license to examine the very parts women were forbidden to acknowledge. That illness was called hysteria, and its reach was extraordinary. The diagnosis was so broad that it became a convenient explanation for almost anything. Women who fainted, women who complained of exhaustion, women who expressed irritability or dissatisfaction, all could be said to suffer from hysteria. Medical texts from the period list symptoms so varied that no clear definition could exist. One woman might be accused of hysteria for crying too much, another for refusing to smile. It is almost laughable that an entire medical discipline flourished by turning everyday emotions into evidence of female instability. The effect was that any form of discontent, no matter how justified, could be treated not as a social problem, but as a medical one. This approach allowed society to protect its own image. If a wife was unhappy, it was not the fault of her restrictive domestic role. If a daughter resisted an arranged marriage, her reluctance was not seen as reasoned but as a sickness. The diagnosis preserved the illusion that all was well with Victorian morality. Instead of admitting to the suffocating expectations placed on women, physicians reclassified that discomfort into a medical file. Families who wanted to avoid gossip accepted this language readily, because it gave them a way to discuss troubling behaviour without admitting failure. The word hysteria spread beyond medical offices. It became a social label whispered at gatherings or written between the lines of letters. A woman's reputation could suffer simply from being rumoured to have the condition, yet it was considered more respectable to be called hysterical than to be suspected of moral corruption. The diagnosis gave a thin cover, allowing women to receive some measure of care while still preserving the family's image. It is not unlike the way modern scandals are softened by euphemisms, as if words themselves can erase responsibility. The contradiction at the heart of this practice was striking. Women were forbidden from acknowledging sexuality, yet doctors openly examined them under the guise of medicine. Treatments demanded close attention to the body, even as women were expected to remain ignorant of how that body functioned. The silence of the home created the conditions for intrusion in the clinic. No one questioned it, because it was presented as a scientific necessity. In a world where even mentioning desire was scandalous, the medical encounter became a socially acceptable way to cross that boundary. Hysteria also reinforced the notion that women were naturally fragile. Doctors wrote about their patients as if weakness were an inherent part of being female. This belief justified not only medical intervention, but also the broader system of social control. Women were told they could not handle intellectual or political life because their nerves were too delicate. Their supposed instability required constant guidance, and the diagnosis of hysteria offered the perfect proof. Reading these records now, I find it deeply unsettling to imagine how many women were silenced, their feelings dismissed as nothing more than symptoms of a fictional disease. Families accepted the diagnosis because it explained what they did not want to see. A woman who was restless might actually be trapped in an unhappy marriage. A girl who cried at night might be overwhelmed by the pressures of social expectation. Instead of confronting those realities, relatives preferred to say she was hysterical. The word carried enough weight to discourage questions. It became easier to place blame on the woman's body than to admit the cruelty of her situation. Even death could be disguised under this language. Records often avoided naming diseases directly, preferring vague phrases like nervous decline or female weakness. This concealment preserved reputations but erased truth. Women died without their suffering acknowledged. Their stories reduced to polite entries in medical notes. To the outside world, the family remained respectable, untouched by scandal. The price of this respectability was silence, and silence allowed injustice to continue unchallenged. The popularity of the diagnosis grew so rapidly that it seemed almost universal. Middle-class families used it to maintain appearances, while physicians used it to secure their authority. Women themselves sometimes used it as a shield, because claiming hysteria could justify a retreat from exhausting duties. Yet what looked like protection was also confinement. To be hysterical was to be seen as unstable, incapable of independence, and forever in need of supervision. This cycle of suppression and medicalization reveals much about Victorian priorities. What mattered most was not truth or health, but the preservation of an image. By creating a condition that could mean anything, society found a way to explain away the unhappiness it had created. Women bore the burden, carrying both the symptoms and the blame. Hysteria was less a medical reality than a cultural tool, one that enforced silence even while pretending to offer care. The story of hysteria is therefore not just about doctors and patients. It is about a system that transformed suffering into evidence of weakness, that redefined resistance as illness, and that maintained order by rewriting pain into propriety. In this sense, hysteria was both a symptom and a strategy, reflecting the fear of what might happen if women were allowed to speak plainly. Women in Victorian society were expected to embody purity, and hysteria became the paradoxical confirmation that they were failing to do so. It explained away their discontent while reinforcing the standards that caused it. The more the term was used, the more it shaped reality, until silence itself became the defining feature of female health. Their voices were restrained, their pain repackaged, and their identities reduced to a diagnosis. The illusion of morality was preserved at all costs, even when it meant sacrificing truth. This was the foundation upon which stranger treatments would soon be justified. Victorian women lived under the shadow of purity, and hysteria became the convenient name for their silence. That silence served the needs of society, not their well-being. It disguised oppression as medicine, and turned ordinary emotions into evidence of disease. Their lives were shaped by silence, their struggles renamed as hysteria, and their dignity preserved only as an illusion. That illusion gave society comfort, but it prepared the ground for even more peculiar interventions. What doctors claimed as therapy would reveal just how far the boundary between science and desire could be stretched. Pelvic massage was introduced in Victorian medicine as a treatment so carefully disguised that it almost seemed respectable. Doctors described it as a remedy for nervous obstruction, a cure for the vague complaints that were all swept under the broad category of hysteria. In reality, it was intimate contact, performed under the authority of science, and its effects went far beyond the sterile explanations written in medical notes. The treatment required physicians to use their hands to stimulate the patient until a release was achieved, and this release was then recorded not as pleasure, but as a therapeutic biological reaction. By calling it medicine, society could look away from the obvious fact that women were experiencing what they were never allowed to admit: physical satisfaction. The language of these medical encounters was deliberately clinical. Physicians insisted that they had no emotional involvement, that they were simply applying a method proven to relieve symptoms. Women were told that what they felt was not immoral but restorative, not passion but physiology. It is almost amusing to think how far they went to pretend that the body could be separated from desire, as if labelling something treatment erased its nature. The contradiction was plain: a society that punished women for even mentioning sexuality simultaneously sent them to receive hands-on therapy under medical supervision. For many women, these appointments became a strange lifeline. They lived in homes where conversation about their bodies was forbidden, where even discomfort had to be hidden to preserve respectability. Yet in the quiet of the consulting room, they were given an experience that offered a kind of relief they could not name. Doctors wrote of muscle relaxation, of tension being released, of nerves being soothed. But what actually occurred was an orgasm. It was a word that could not be spoken in polite society, yet it was happening behind the closed doors of clinics and hospitals with astonishing regularity. Patients often returned for repeat treatments, and in many cases, physicians scheduled them as if they were routine checkups. A woman who came once might be advised to return weekly, or even more often if her symptoms persisted. The repetition created a pattern. Women began to rely on these sessions not just for the supposed cure, but for the unmistakable improvement in mood and energy afterward. It is not unlike modern people who return to the gym, the spa, or even therapy sessions, claiming health benefits while also seeking the emotional lift that comes from those rituals. The key difference was that these Victorian treatments carried an unspoken dimension of pleasure that no one dared to acknowledge. Doctors themselves faced difficulties. Some admitted privately or in medical correspondence that the procedure was exhausting. The manual stimulation required time and effort, and with a growing number of patients, their hands and patience were stretched thin. This led to experiments with mechanical devices that could assist or replace the physician's labour. But before those inventions, the reality was that countless women experienced release directly through their doctor's hands, written neatly in medical files as a purely physiological reaction. The reception among patients varied, but many women described feeling calmer, lighter, and more at ease in their daily lives after treatment. While they could not use the vocabulary of desire, they spoke of relief from heaviness, of better sleep, of a restored sense of self. These results only reinforced the popularity of pelvic massage as a cure for hysteria. Husbands, often unaware of the true nature of the treatment, accepted that their wives were under medical care, grateful that the sessions reduced irritability or melancholy in the household. The irony, of course, was that the improvement came not from tonics or sermons, but from something the culture strictly forbade in any other setting. There was an element of secrecy and complicity in the practice. Women rarely described the treatment outside of the medical room, and doctors cloaked it in heavy jargon to prevent scandal. To the outside world, it was a medical necessity. Inside, however, it was a ritual that blurred the boundary between medicine and intimacy. Some women may have understood this duality clearly, while others accepted the doctor's framing to protect themselves from shame. Either way, the outcome was the same: the female body experienced release, and the cycle of silence continued. What makes this chapter of history so striking is how society tolerated it. At the same time that sermons condemned female desire and magazines urged women to stay pure, the medical community institutionalized a practice that directly contradicted those messages. It thrived not because people were blind, but because the language of medicine provided a shield strong enough to preserve the illusion of morality. Families could send daughters and wives to the doctor without guilt, even as those visits provided what no husband or priest would openly permit: I find it unsettling to think about how many women discovered physical relief in clinics while remaining convinced that it was not their own desire, but merely their nerves being treated. This contradiction set the stage for profound changes in how women experience their own bodies. Though the treatment was framed as therapy, it introduced them to sensations and emotions they were never supposed to know. The very act of disguising orgasm as medicine revealed the deep hypocrisy of Victorian values. It also revealed how easily authority could manipulate language to normalize what would otherwise have been condemned. Women walked away from those appointments calmer, less troubled, and sometimes even transformed, but they could never speak openly of why. Victorian doctors claimed their hands were instruments of science, and their patients accepted that explanation. Behind those claims, however, was a reality that defied the strict boundaries of the age. The treatment was not simply a cure for hysteria. It was a gateway to experiences that society worked tirelessly to suppress. By reducing it to a biological reflex, they gave women permission to feel what they were forbidden to name. Women in the Victorian age entered clinics seeking help for vague complaints, and they left with bodies relieved and minds lifted. Doctors insisted it was medicine. Patients accepted it as treatment, and families were none the wiser. In this arrangement, silence was preserved, reputations were protected, and yet something entirely new was quietly taking place. The treatment of hysteria through pelvic massage reshaped how women understood relief, even if they could not call it pleasure. It was medicine by name, but something far more disruptive in practice. That disruption would soon demand new solutions, as the growing number of patients made manual methods unsustainable. The search for alternatives would open the door to devices that changed everything. In the Victorian medical world, orgasm was not considered an act of sexuality but a carefully redefined medical event. Physicians went to great lengths to describe the release as a purely physiological response, free of moral meaning. They insisted that their role was detached, their emotions absent, and their actions purely professional. By reframing what was clearly an intimate experience as a sterile procedure, they created a system where women could undergo treatments that would have been unthinkable in any other context. This reframing not only protected doctors, but also gave women a shield against the accusations that might otherwise have destroyed their reputations. The patients themselves were instructed to view their reactions through the same lens. They were told that what happened on the examination table was not pleasure but therapy, not indulgence but correction. Doctors emphasized that it was no more shameful than having a tooth pulled or a wound stitched. It is almost absurd that an entire culture convinced women that physical ecstasy could be explained away as if it were no different than a sneeze. The logic was simple. If the experience could be categorized as medical, then it carried no moral stain. Yet the reality was far more complicated, because women were not immune to the emotions such experiences provoked. Inside the clinic, this illusion worked effectively. Women submitted to the procedures without speaking of desire, and doctors maintained their language of science. But outside, the boundaries shifted. What was acceptable in a medical office became dangerous if repeated in private. Women who touched themselves or sought satisfaction on their own risked condemnation. The act was considered immoral when claimed for personal use, yet it was entirely legitimate when supervised by a man in a white coat. The contradiction was enormous, but society accepted it because it reinforced the idea that women could only experience such things under authority. This framing created a strange paradox in female lives. They learned that their bodies could respond, that their nerves could release tension in a way that brought profound calm, but they were not permitted to claim ownership of that discovery. Instead, they were told that such responses were involuntary and meaningless, evidence not of pleasure but of illness being cured. It is not unlike how modern workplaces sometimes disguise leisure or comfort as productivity, repackaging enjoyment so that it seems acceptable only when serving a larger purpose. In both cases, human experience was controlled by how it was labelled. The insistence on purity extended even to medical records. Doctors documented each session with clinical detachment, noting the time, the symptoms, and the successful resolution of hysteria. Nowhere did they write the word pleasure. The records describe relaxation, reduced irritability, improved sleep, and restoration of balance. But between the lines, it is clear that these were euphemisms for something much more recognizable. Patients often left calmer, even joyful, but the language of medicine ensured that their joy could not be acknowledged as such. For the women themselves, the situation was deeply conflicted. On the one hand, they were reassured that nothing shameful had happened. On the other hand, their bodies told them that what they felt was powerful, undeniable, and unlike anything they were taught to expect from marriage or duty. Some accepted the medical explanation gratefully, because it allowed them to preserve their sense of respectability. Others, quietly and perhaps guiltily, recognized that there was more happening than anyone dared to admit. I cannot help but feel sympathy for those women, torn between the relief they discovered and the guilt pressed upon them by the society around them. This contradiction exposed a deeper truth. Victorian morality was less about protecting virtue than about controlling context. A woman's body could be touched, aroused, and released, as long as it was done under the sanctioned cover of science. The same act, when performed by herself, was condemned as perversion. By drawing these arbitrary lines, the culture ensured that women never gained independence over their own sexuality. Even their most personal experiences were filtered through the authority of others. Husbands rarely questioned this arrangement. If their wives were calmer after treatments, they accepted it as a medical success. Few considered what the therapy truly entailed, and fewer still wanted to confront the possibility that doctors were offering what they themselves either could not or would not provide. To admit such a reality would have challenged the foundation of male authority. So the silence persisted, reinforced by both ignorance and denial. The normalization of medical orgasm also prevented broader conversations about female desire. Because the experience was labeled as treatment, it could not be connected to discussions of sexuality or equality. It remained hidden, confined to the clinical space, stripped of any power to change how society viewed women. This limitation ensured that while women could benefit individually, the system that oppressed them continued unchanged. The very framework that gave them relief also kept them captive. The paradox of Victorian medicine was that it gave women a taste of liberation while denying them the language to describe it. They could feel, but not name. They could experience, but not claim. By controlling words, society controlled reality. What might have been the beginning of the acknowledgement became instead a reinforcement of silence. Women were told that their experiences belonged not to them but to science, and that their bodies spoke only in symptoms, not in desires. The culture of the age prided itself on rationality and restraint, but its medical practices revealed something else entirely. Beneath the polished surface of morality was a system built on contradiction, where women could be both forbidden and indulged, silent and expressive, oppressed and comforted, all within the same breath. Orgasm, in this context, was stripped of its human meaning and remade as a sterile reaction, safe to acknowledge only in the shadow of authority. Victorian women were thus caught in a cycle of denial and discovery. Their bodies betrayed truths that society refused to recognize, and doctors transformed those truths into a form of therapy. In this carefully constructed illusion, everyone could pretend that purity remained intact. Yet the illusion was fragile, and the demand for treatment only grew stronger. Women were told that orgasm was medicine, not desire, and they learned to repeat that lesson to themselves. It offered safety, but it also reinforced control. The system thrived precisely because it disguised rebellion as obedience. The more women sought the therapy, the more society convinced itself that morality had been preserved. Orgasm was accepted in the Victorian clinic because it wore the mask of science. That mask allowed women to experience what they were otherwise denied, and it allowed men to maintain their authority. But with each session, The line between treatment and indulgence blurred further, and the illusion became harder to sustain. The strain of maintaining that boundary would soon reveal itself in unexpected ways. As the demand for these therapies grew beyond what doctors could easily manage, the popularity of hysteria treatments grew so rapidly that demand soon surpassed all expectations. Women who once visited their doctors occasionally began arranging appointments on a regular basis, sometimes several times a week. Each treatment brought relief, and with relief came the subtle recognition that life felt unbearable without it. What had been framed as a medical solution became, in practice, something that patients could not live without. Doctors recorded improvements in mood and energy, but they also noted a troubling trend: women who skipped their treatments often returned more distressed than before. What began as therapy was quietly evolving into dependence. This dependence carried a weight that families could not ignore. Women who had once been described as delicate but manageable became restless if denied access to the clinic. They reported sleeplessness, anxiety, and sudden bursts of irritability when their schedules were interrupted. The irony was that the very treatment designed to restore order created a need that disrupted households even more. It is almost darkly humorous to imagine Victorian doctors congratulating themselves for curing hysteria, while at the same time producing patients desperate to come back. Husbands tolerated the expense because they saw temporary improvements, but they grew uneasy as visits multiplied. Some suspected exaggeration, but few dared to question the authority of medicine. As weeks turned into months, the cycle deepened. Patients began to invent reasons to return for therapy, describing vague symptoms that could not be disproved. A headache, a restless night, or even a feeling of heaviness became justification for another appointment. The physicians, bound by their own definitions, rarely refused. Every complaint could be interpreted as evidence of hysteria, and every cure required the same method. The more common the practice became, the harder it was to separate genuine need from eager expectation. Some women confessed, indirectly, to feeling worse between treatments than they had before beginning them. They described emptiness, irritability, or unexplained sadness when too much time had passed. Families noticed changes in temperament, marking their wives or daughters as unpredictable if the therapy was delayed. The release that once calmed them now seemed to expose a deeper hunger. It reminds me of modern cases where people grow dependent on wellness rituals, supplements, or therapies, insisting they cannot function without routines that once felt optional. What began as a remedy for vague distress became a necessity, and necessity quickly turned into obsession. Doctors themselves noticed the intensity of these attachments. Some complained that their waiting rooms were filled with repeat patients demanding appointments more frequently than could be managed. Physicians who prided themselves on professionalism faced accusations of favoritism or impropriety when patients grew too attached. Medical journals of the period reveal subtle discomfort, the fear that hysteria treatment, rather than curing women, was creating a new category of disorder. For patients, the stakes were even higher. To miss a session was to risk emotional collapse. Some women became so unstable between treatments that families feared for their mental health. Reports circulated of women sinking into depression, refusing food, or falling into uncontrollable fits when they were denied access to therapy. The line between medical necessity and psychological craving blurred, leaving observers unsettled. I cannot help but think how terrifying it must have been for these women, caught between a society that denied their desires and a medical system that fed them in secret but never admitted the truth. When a doctor retired, moved away, or became ill, the consequences could be catastrophic for his patients. Women accustomed to regular therapy often experienced complete breakdowns when suddenly deprived of it. Some were described as inconsolable, weeping for days, or lashing out in anger. In certain cases, families admitted them to institutions, claiming their hysteria had grown uncontrollable. Yet behind those walls, the truth was less about disease and more about withdrawal from what had become an essential ritual of their lives. This dependence revealed the dangerous power of redefining pleasure as medicine. By stripping the experience of its true name, doctors had convinced women that their relief was purely therapeutic, but their bodies knew otherwise. Each treatment reinforced a connection between release and survival. The result was a generation of women who associated calmness, stability, and even sanity with regular visits to the doctor's office. Once that connection was made, it was nearly impossible to sever. Husbands and families faced their own dilemmas. Some viewed their wives' frequent visits with suspicion, wondering whether the therapy was masking something inappropriate. Others dismissed concerns, preferring to believe the medical explanation rather than confront unsettling alternatives. The silence of Victorian propriety ensured that few ever spoke openly about what these treatments entailed. By refusing to name it, society allowed the cycle of dependence to grow unchecked. The women themselves bore the heaviest burden. They were trapped in a system where their only access to relief came through methods they could not admit to desiring. They learned to disguise their longing as illness, to couch their need in medical language, and to plead for therapy without revealing the truth. What society called hysteria was in many ways the expression of their own suppressed humanity, but it was hidden under layers of shame and silence. The paradox became too large to ignore. Doctors complained of overwork, families worried about reputations, and patients spiraled when deprived of access. Yet the system persisted, because no one dared to challenge its foundations. To admit the truth would have meant acknowledging female desire, and that was something Victorian culture could not allow. Women grew increasingly dependent on therapy framed as medicine, and that dependency often spiraled into crisis when interrupted. Families concealed breakdowns, physicians avoided uncomfortable admissions, and society maintained the illusion that everything remained under control. In reality, control was slipping, and the consequences were becoming more visible. The illusion of therapy had produced something far closer to obsession, one that neither doctors nor patients could fully manage. Women found themselves unable to stop returning, and doctors could not bring themselves to refuse. The more treatments they received, the less stable they became without them. It was a cycle that revealed the profound hypocrisy at the heart of Victorian medicine, where control was preached but dependency quietly flourished. That dependency, however, also drove innovation, as the growing demand pushed doctors to seek new ways to provide the therapy without exhausting themselves. The strain of performing pelvic massage by hand soon became too much for many Victorian physicians. They complained in private that the procedure was time-consuming, physically exhausting, and impossible to maintain with the growing number of patients demanding regular treatment. The search for alternatives was inevitable, and it led to the development of mechanical devices that promised to deliver the same results with less effort. These tools began as crude contraptions powered by water or electricity, yet their purpose was disguised under the language of medicine. To the outside world, they were simply instruments for restoring balance to nervous systems. To the women who used them, they quickly became something far more significant. The first of these devices was water-based. By directing a strong stream of water toward the body, physicians found they could replicate the effects of manual therapy without tiring themselves. Hospitals installed special equipment in private rooms, marketed as hydrotherapy, with no mention of the sensations it created. Patients were told the rushing water stimulated circulation and relieved congestion. What it also provided was a form of release that many women described, in coded terms, as invigorating or calming beyond expectation. It is almost laughable how Victorian medicine managed to transform a fountain into an official cure for hysteria, as though plumbing had suddenly become a therapeutic breakthrough. As electricity became more common, inventors seized on its potential. Early vibratory machines were large, noisy, and awkward to operate. They required cranks, pulleys, or electrical currents that filled the room with sound and motion. Despite their size, these machines worked more quickly than manual methods, allowing doctors to treat more patients in less time. Some models were installed in clinics, while others were portable enough to be carried from house to house. Advertisements avoided explicit references, describing them as general tonics for the nerves, but physicians and patients alike understood what they were truly designed to accomplish. The presence of machines in medical offices had a secondary effect. It lent an even greater sense of legitimacy to the practice. Where the human hand could be questioned, the machine appeared impersonal, a tool of science rather than an extension of flesh. Women who might have felt embarrassed at prolonged manual sessions often found comfort in the neutrality of a device. They could tell themselves that the machine was simply an instrument, no more intimate than a stethoscope or thermometer. This fiction made the treatment more acceptable, even as it spread the practice further. For wealthy women, the next step was obvious. Why depend entirely on the doctor when similar devices could be obtained for private use? Some purchased smaller versions designed for the home, marketed in discreet catalogues, or recommended quietly by sympathetic physicians. These machines, though still bulky by modern standards, allowed women to experience relief on their own schedules. Families with means could install water therapy systems or buy electrical models, treating them as respectable household equipment. It is not unlike the way modern homes fill with fitness machines or wellness gadgets, purchased under the banner of health, but often serving much more personal needs. The popularity of these devices reflected the scale of demand. Once women discovered the benefits of treatment, they sought ways to access it more frequently and with less dependency on busy physicians. Private ownership offered freedom, but it also deepened the secrecy. While doctors could at least claim medical authority, women who used machines in their homes had to maintain even greater silence. Servants were expected not to question, husbands were told vague explanations, and the subject was never raised outside the household. Respectability was preserved by pretending the machines were nothing more than standard health appliances. Medical journals of the period often reviewed these devices with enthusiasm, praising their efficiency and their contribution to managing hysteria. They described the relief of symptoms, the improved temperaments of patients, and the reduction of strain on practitioners. What they avoided, carefully, was acknowledging what these machines actually produced. The word orgasm never appeared in print. Instead, writers described outcomes as resolution, release of congestion, or restoration of equilibrium. The avoidance of truth was so consistent that generations of readers could study the literature without realizing what was hidden between the lines. Women who used these devices often kept private notes or letters, recording their experiences in language that balanced between medical respectability and personal discovery. They described feeling renewed, calm, or strangely alive. Some confessed to feeling guilty afterward, uncertain whether they had crossed a line. Others expressed gratitude that such treatments existed at all, believing them to be the only thing keeping them sane in a world that offered so few outlets for their frustrations. I find it striking that what was called progress in medicine was, for many women, the first genuine encounter with their own bodily autonomy. The spread of machines also shifted the balance of power in subtle ways. Doctors remained gatekeepers for many women, but the possibility of private use introduced an element of independence. For the first time, women could access relief without needing an appointment, without seeking permission, and without explanation. This independence, though fragile, hinted at a change far larger than medicine intended. By disguising devices of pleasure as medical tools, society had unwittingly given women access to a resource that challenged the very structures meant to confine them. Yet the secrecy surrounding these devices never lessened. The cultural silence demanded that their true purpose remain unspoken. Families maintained appearances, physicians preserved reputations, and women concealed their private rituals. The paradox grew deeper. Victorian society condemned any open discussion of female desire, while at the same time filling homes and clinics with machines designed to stimulate it. The contradiction was too obvious to ignore, but ignoring it was precisely what the culture demanded. What began as a solution to physician fatigue evolved into a phenomenon that reached far beyond the clinic. Machines multiplied, ownership expanded, and the rituals of treatment became embedded in daily life for many women. Beneath the surface of propriety, an entire subculture of hidden practice thrived, powered by electricity, water, and silence. Doctors, patients, and inventors all contributed to this development, whether through intention or denial. The result was a world where medical devices quietly delivered what morality forbade, and where women discovered in secret what society insisted they could never seek. Respectability was preserved, but at a cost the truth of what these machines provided could never be admitted. Victorian physicians turned to machines out of necessity, but those machines gave women more than relief from symptoms. They offered control, access, and independence, even if only in the shadows. The silence of society allowed the paradox to survive, but the growing popularity of mechanical therapy ensured that it could not be contained forever. Women had begun to take their treatment into their own hands, quite literally, and with each new device, the illusion of control slipped further away. That quiet revolution, born of exhaustion and disguised as medicine, was only the beginning. The rise of specialized institutions would take this hidden practice to an entirely new scale, one that resembled something more like a retreat than a doctor's office. In the quieter edges of Victorian cities, far from the crowded streets and respectable townhouses, new institutions began to appear. These were not hospitals in the ordinary sense, nor were they places openly advertised as havens of pleasure. They were established as nursing homes or sanitaria for women diagnosed with hysteria, and their number grew steadily as demand increased. Families who could afford the fees sent wives, daughters, or sisters to these retreats with the belief that extended care would restore balance to their fragile nerves. What they often discovered, though rarely acknowledged, was that these institutions functioned less like hospitals and more like hidden spas devoted to a very particular form of treatment. The daily routines in these places followed a familiar structure. Women arrived with letters of referral from physicians, complaining of nervous exhaustion, sleeplessness, or persistent melancholy. Upon admission, they were given private rooms, meals designed for convalescence, and access to gardens or drawing rooms where rest was encouraged. But the centerpiece of their stay was always the same therapy sessions that concluded with the so-called pelvic relaxation treatment. Each patient underwent this ritual regularly, sometimes multiple times during a week-long stay. The procedure was framed in medical terms, but the relief it provided was understood, even if never spoken aloud. It is almost ridiculous to imagine a culture that condemned female pleasure, creating entire institutions where it was scheduled as part of the daily routine. The atmosphere of these nursing homes was carefully cultivated to resemble gentility rather than scandal. Interiors were decorated with heavy curtains, polished wood, and tasteful furnishings that suggested respectability. Staff were trained to behave with quiet professionalism, maintaining the appearance of a proper medical environment. Visitors might see women reclining with books, sipping restorative tonics, or strolling through gardens, never suspecting that the true heart of the establishment lay behind closed treatment room doors. The design of the space itself helped sustain the illusion, ensuring that patients could move between worlds without openly confronting the contradiction. For the women admitted, these institutions offered more than physical relief. They represented a temporary escape from the relentless roles of wife, mother, and daughter. In a society where domestic duty was constant, the chance to be treated as a patient brought unexpected freedom. Days were structured around rest, care, and attention, rather than chores or obligations. In this way, the institutions functioned as sanctuaries where women were allowed to set aside the expectations of their families. It is not unlike the modern idea of luxury retreats, where people justify indulgence by framing it as wellness or self-care. The language changes, but the impulse is strikingly similar. These retreats also fostered a sense of community among patients. Women who might never have spoken openly in their homes found themselves surrounded by others undergoing the same rituals. Although the topic was rarely discussed explicitly, a quiet recognition passed between them. They understood that their relief was shared, that their experiences were not unique, and that within the walls of these institutions, the rules of propriety loosened ever so slightly. The silence remained, but it was a silence tinged with solidarity. Doctors overseeing these facilities emphasized the importance of long-term care. They argued that short visits to clinics were insufficient for chronic cases of hysteria, and that only prolonged treatment could truly restore health. This argument conveniently supported the financial model of the institutions, which relied on extended stays. Families, anxious to see improvement, paid the fees and asked a few questions. Husbands were particularly eager to endorse the arrangement, relieved that their wives returned calmer, more compliant, and temporarily freed of the irritability that had unsettled households. The reality, of course, was that these women were being given access to something society denied them elsewhere. The reputation of these nursing homes varied. Some were spoken of in respectable tones, recommended by physicians as ideal environments for recovery. Others gained whispers of suspicion, their names exchanged in half-muttered conversations. Still, few dared to confront the truth directly. To do so would have meant acknowledging what the therapy truly entailed, and that acknowledgement threatened the entire structure of Victorian morality. By allowing the silence to continue, society preserved both its illusions and its institutions. For the women inside, however, the impact was deeply personal. They discovered that their mood stabilized, their energy returned, and their sense of self sharpened during their stays. They attributed this to the careful routines, the quiet, or the attention of staff. But beneath those justifications lay the undeniable fact of their treatments. Some carried the memory of these experiences with them long after leaving, longing for the relief that only the institution could provide. Others returned again and again, making residency almost a seasonal habit. The expansion of these facilities reflected the scale of demand. In many cities, entire suburbs developed reputations for housing retreats for women, much like seaside resorts or spa towns. The clientele was almost exclusively female, drawn from families that could afford to pay for discretion. Behind their respectable facades, these institutions thrived, their success built on a blend of denial and indulgence. They stood as monuments to a society that refused to speak the truth, yet built entire industries upon it. For doctors, the existence of such places offered both convenience and authority. They could refer patients to facilities where treatments would continue without straining their own schedules. For families, the homes promised relief from the disruption of living with a restless or distressed woman. And for the women themselves, they offered a rare kind of liberation, one that came not from words or declarations but from the quiet, repetitive rituals carried out in treatment rooms. I find it haunting to consider how these institutions gave women moments of freedom under the pretense of illness, freedom they could not claim openly in their own lives. The growth of these nursing homes signalled a shift in the balance of Victorian society. What began as an isolated clinical practice had expanded into a network of hidden sanctuaries, disguised as medical care but functioning as escapes. Women entered with the language of sickness, but what they found was a temporary taste of autonomy, however veiled. The contradiction was never resolved, only sustained by silence. Victorian society prided itself on order and morality, yet it built retreats where women quietly discovered relief forbidden elsewhere. The more these institutions multiplied, the clearer it became that hysteria was not an illness at all, but a symptom of a culture unable to accept female humanity. Families pretended, doctors documented, and patients endured, all under the cover of a polite lie. Women were admitted to institutions for hysteria, treated with routine therapies, and returned to their homes calmer but never freer. The homes gave them temporary escape, but they also deepened their dependence on silence. This growing system of hidden sanctuaries revealed both the hypocrisy of Victorian values and the power of need, and as the demand continued to rise, even the confines of these retreats would not be enough to contain the paradox. In grand Victorian households, where appearances were everything and discretion was a form of currency, the practice of hysteria treatment soon extended beyond the clinic walls. Wealthy women who grew accustomed to regular therapy sessions often faced the dilemma of what to do when a physician was not available. The solution, in some homes, was both practical and unsettling. Household servants were trained to administer the treatment in place of the doctor. What began as a medical service within institutions seeped into private life, turning bedrooms and drawing rooms into makeshift consulting spaces. The silence of the age ensured that no one outside the household was ever meant to know. The process of instruction was often subtle. A mistress would return from the clinic calmer, more composed, and eventually she would decide that the results could not wait until her next appointment. Servants, already bound by duty and loyalty, became unwilling participants in this intimate arrangement. They were ordered to follow exact instructions, told where to apply pressure, and how to recognize when the treatment was complete. It is almost absurd to think of etiquette manuals telling servants how to pour tea with precision, while behind closed doors, they were being shown how to replicate medical intimacy. For the mistress, it was simply continuity of care. For the servant, it was a command they had no power to refuse. The secrecy surrounding these practices was absolute. A servant who spoke even a word of what occurred risked immediate dismissal and permanent damage to their reputation. Many were reminded that their livelihoods, and often the survival of their families, depended on obedience. The imbalance of power was overwhelming. A wealthy woman could demand silence and receive it, because the consequences for breaking trust were too severe. Servants became keepers of their mistress's hidden rituals, carrying knowledge they could never reveal. Some accounts suggest that servants described their experiences in private letters or testimonies, revealing feelings of unease and even horror at what they were compelled to do. For them, this was not medicine but humiliation, a violation of boundaries masked as duty. Yet they endured, because endurance was the condition of their class. It is not unlike the modern reality of employees who are forced to perform uncomfortable tasks under the guise of professionalism, swallowing their discomfort to keep their jobs. The Victorian household magnified this reality, embedding it in daily life where the divide between servant and mistress was both intimate and unbridgeable. For the women who instructed their staff, the situation was framed very differently. They convinced themselves that the treatment was purely medical, that their instructions were clinical rather than personal. They reassured themselves that servants were simply carrying out another form of care, no different from dressing wounds or managing baths. But the truth lingered beneath the surface. These were acts of profound intimacy, shifted into domestic service because propriety demanded silence. By maintaining the illusion of therapy, mistresses protected themselves from shame, while their servants bore the unspoken cost. The domestic arrangement of treatment highlighted the contradictions of Victorian morality. On one hand, society proclaimed the sanctity of female purity and the dignity of respectable homes. On the other hand, those same homes contained hidden practices that blurred every boundary between medicine, desire, and coercion. The servants who carried out these tasks became invisible participants in the larger hypocrisy, silenced not by choice, but by necessity. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine how many households quietly sustained this contradiction, with lives divided between the rituals of public respectability and the secrets of private treatment. This practice also reinforced the idea that women of privilege could bend rules in ways that poorer women could not. A wealthy lady could transform her hysteria treatment into a private ritual, confident that her servants would comply. A woman of lower means, without servants or funds for devices, had no such options. her dependence on doctors remained absolute, or her suffering remained untreated. Thus, even in matters of hidden pleasure and disguised therapy, class divisions determined who had access, who held control, and who bore the burden. The involvement of servants also ensured that the culture of silence extended downward. Entire households became complicit in the charade, with multiple people aware of rituals no one dared to speak of. Servants who prepared treatment rooms, cleaned equipment, or assisted their mistresses carried fragments of knowledge, all bound together by fear of exposure. Respectability was preserved because everyone, from the mistress to the lowest maid, had something to lose if the truth escaped. In the broader context of Victorian society, this domestic extension of hysteria treatment illustrates how deeply the illusion of morality was woven into everyday life. Clinics and hospitals may have appeared to be the primary spaces of therapy, but in reality, the practice seeped into parlours and bedrooms, transforming private homes into hidden extensions of the medical world. The line between physician and servant, treatment and service, blurred until the distinctions no longer mattered. For the women who relied on their servants, the therapy provided not only relief, but also a sense of control. They had brought the authority of medicine into their own homes, reshaped it to fit their daily schedules, and concealed it within the walls of propriety. For the servants, it was yet another task demanded in a world where their own boundaries held no weight. This hidden layer of Victorian domestic life reveals not only the persistence of silence, but also the unequal costs of sustaining it. Mistresses instructed, servants obeyed, and households carried secrets too heavy to speak. The illusion of medical necessity allowed everything to continue, but beneath it lay the unsettling truth of coerced intimacy and unspoken dependence. The story of hysteria treatment was never just about doctors and patients. It was also about the homes that quietly became theatres for practices no one dared admit. Women brought hysteria treatments into their houses, trained their servants to perform them, and lived as if nothing unusual had occurred. Servants submitted, endured, and kept the silence, for to do otherwise meant ruin. It was another layer in the great Victorian hypocrisy, another example of how purity on the surface concealed practices no one wanted to see. And as this hidden system expanded, it laid the foundation for an even stranger phenomenon, one where the rituals of therapy grew into something resembling faith itself. The spread of hysterical treatments eventually gave rise to something larger than medicine. Women no longer viewed the sessions only as remedies for nervous complaints, or as therapies prescribed by physicians. They began to see them as essential rituals, repeated with the regularity of religious observances. In a world that demanded their silence and submission, the brief moments of release felt like proof that they were still alive. These women were not addicted to their doctors, nor even to the idea of sexuality as it might have been defined in other contexts. What they became attached to was the fleeting sensation of existence itself, the sharp reminder that beneath all the layers of duty and restraint, their bodies still belonged to them. The ritual nature of these treatments cannot be overstated. Women arranged their schedules around appointments, sometimes planning social visits, household tasks, and even travel with the therapy in mind. For many, it became the one event they anticipated with eagerness, a secret highlight in lives otherwise marked by monotony and duty. It is almost grimly funny to imagine Victorian households carefully managing propriety, while their mistresses prepared with equal care for what was essentially a private religious service of the flesh. The irony was that the more society suppressed open acknowledgement of female desire, the more powerful the hidden rituals became. In these quiet sessions, women found what sermons and moral codes denied them a sense of personal liberation. The explosion of feeling that followed treatment was not described in the language of lust, but in terms of relief, freedom, and clarity. Patients wrote in private diaries of feeling whole, of feeling balanced, of feeling human again. The very vagueness of the medical vocabulary allowed them to translate what they felt into words that could be tolerated in their society. Yet behind those words lay something much closer to devotion. This devotion mirrored the intensity of religious faith. Women spoke of the treatments as though they were sacraments, necessary for the preservation of sanity and dignity. Some described a kind of transformation afterward, a lightness of spirit, or a sudden calm that carried them through the demands of family life. They approached their doctors not as lovers, but as priests of an unspoken creed, guiding them through rituals that cleansed and renewed. It is not unlike the way modern people speak of yoga retreats or meditation practices, framing them as wellness traditions but often investing them with a near spiritual sense of salvation. The terminology changes, but the pattern of devotion remains recognizable. The psychological effects of this attachment were profound. Women who might otherwise have sunk into despair discovered a lifeline in their treatments. They learned to endure suffocating marriages, oppressive domestic duties, and stifling expectations by clinging to the promise of their next session. The brief eruption of sensation reminded them that they were not entirely erased by their roles. For a moment, they were more than wives, more than mothers, more than ornaments of propriety. They were individuals with bodies that responded, that demanded recognition, that refused to be silenced completely. Doctors often encouraged this devotion, though without admitting its true cause. They spoke of the importance of regular sessions for maintaining equilibrium, recommending schedules that resembled the calendar of religious observances. Weekly or bi-weekly appointments became standard for many women, and for chronic cases, even daily treatments were suggested. The more the routine was emphasized, the more women relied upon it. The cycle fed itself, turning medical procedure into something approaching ritual dependence. This dependence carried dangers as well as relief. Women began to feel unstable when treatments were delayed, restless when their schedules were interrupted, and despondent if their doctors became unavailable. Their lives revolved around the promise of release to the point that it overshadowed other sources of comfort or meaning. I cannot help but think of how heartbreaking it must have been to tie one's entire sense of vitality to a practice that could never be openly acknowledged, that always had to be cloaked in shame and silence. The fragility of this arrangement was immense, yet it endured because society offered no alternative. In the private writings that survive, this attachment appears again and again. Some women recorded their gratitude for physicians, not in romantic language, but in terms that bordered on reverence. Others described the feeling of emptiness when treatments were interrupted, using words that echo the descriptions of spiritual longing in religious texts. Their bodies became temples, and the therapy became the ritual through which they were reminded of their own humanity. It was an act of survival, but it was also an act of devotion to something beyond the reach of Victorian morality. Husbands, largely ignorant of the true nature of the practice, sometimes noticed the intensity of their wives' anticipation. They saw the improvement afterward, but they rarely understood the depth of attachment. For them, it was enough that their households ran more smoothly, that irritability and melancholy seemed less disruptive. The possibility that their wives were experiencing something akin to spiritual rebirth in another man's office was too unsettling to consider. Silence protected them from the truth, just as it protected the women from shame. The culture that produced this phenomenon remained blind to its implications. By refusing to recognize female desire openly, Victorian society forced it underground, where it took on the qualities of faith. Women did not worship their doctors, nor even the treatments themselves, but the moment of existence that the treatments gave them. They worshipped the fleeting awareness that they were alive, that they were more than the roles imposed upon them. This form of devotion was invisible to the world, but it shaped the inner lives of countless women. The addiction was not to men, nor to the idea of sexuality, but to survival itself. In the absence of other outlets, the ritual of treatment became the only place where life felt tangible. The irony was crushing a culture that celebrated morality above all else. inadvertently created a system where hidden rituals of release became the closest thing many women had to freedom. Victorian women turned their medical treatments into private rites of existence, repeated with the fervour of devotion. They found in them the one place where silence was broken, not in words but in sensations. It was a fragile devotion, one that could collapse the moment treatments were denied, and when denial did come, it revealed just how perilously close many women were to despair. Victorian women who sought treatment for hysteria found themselves caught in an endless conflict between shame and anticipation. Each visit to the doctor provided relief, a fleeting sense of being alive. But the moment it ended, guilt crept in. They had been taught since girlhood that modesty was their highest virtue, that the body was not to be acknowledged, and that desire was unthinkable. Yet the treatments forced them to face sensations that morality told them they should never know. The contradiction was overwhelming. They left the consulting room calmer, even restored, but with a lingering unease that they had crossed a line, even if the line was invisible and unspoken. The secrecy of these visits was absolute. Wives did not tell their husbands the true nature of their therapy. Mothers hid it from their children, and women concealed it from their friends. Officially, they were seeking care for fragile health, nervous exhaustion, or recurring illness. In reality, they were participating in rituals of release that could never be named. It is almost comical to imagine respectable Victorian women rehearsing excuses about headaches or faintness, while carefully arranging weekly appointments for something so obviously more than medicine. This constant concealment was as exhausting as the illness it was meant to cure, for it forced women to live two lives, one of purity in public and another of secret dependence in private. The paradox was sharpened by what followed each session. For a brief time, women felt lighter, steadier, and more able to face the demands of home, but the relief carried with it a heavy shadow of guilt. They were told it was medical, yet their bodies insisted otherwise. Some admitted in diaries that they felt as though they were deceiving themselves, clinging to the doctor's language because it was the only way to protect their reputations. Others turned the guilt inward, punishing themselves with thoughts of sin and weakness. The very practice that restored their balance also threatened their sense of morality. This cycle created a strange rhythm. A woman might leave the doctor's office with her conscience troubled, but before long, she began to feel the weight of her nerves again. The anticipation of the next treatment overshadowed her guilt, pulling her back into the same loop. Shame was forgotten when the need became too strong, only to return the moment relief was found. It is not unlike modern patterns of behaviour where people condemn themselves for indulgence, yet cannot resist repeating it, an endless spiral of guilt and craving. The difference was that in Victorian times, the indulgence was cloaked in respectability, even as it devoured the spirit. Some women grew so entangled in this rhythm that they began scheduling new appointments before even leaving the clinic. They felt trapped, unable to resist planning for the next encounter, even as they reproached themselves for what had just occurred. The doctor's reassurance that it was only medicine helped, but it did not erase the unease. At home, they returned to lives defined by duty and silence, knowing that their bodies carried a secret their families could never be allowed to guess. The psychological toll of this contradiction was immense. Women began to see themselves as unstable, not because of the illness, but because of the emotional turmoil surrounding its cure. They oscillated between relief and self-reproach, caught in a loop that seemed endless. This inner conflict eroded their confidence, convincing them that they were weak, guilty, or broken. Families noticed only that treatments made them calmer, never realizing the hidden storm that followed. I cannot help but feel sorrow for those women, burdened not only by the repression of their society, but also by the crushing weight of shame imposed upon their most private experiences. The moral structure of the time ensured that no resolution was possible. To speak openly of what they felt was impossible. To abandon treatment was equally unthinkable, for the suffering without it was unbearable. Thus, they lived suspended between two realities, respectable wives and mothers on the surface, conflicted patients in secret. The strain wore on their minds as much as their bodies, creating a perpetual state of anxiety. Doctors did little to ease this conflict. Their clinical language reinforced the illusion, but they offered no comfort for the shame. By refusing to acknowledge the full nature of the treatments, they left their patients alone with their guilt. The silence that protected society also condemned women to solitude in their moral struggles. They learned to endure, as they endured so much else, by burying their feelings beneath layers of obedience and pretense. The result was a generation of women whose lives were defined by contradictions they could not resolve. Their morality told them they were failing, their bodies told them they were alive, and their doctors told them nothing at all. The illusion of therapy preserved their reputations, but it did not preserve their peace of mind. The shame followed them, lingering like a shadow that darkened even the brightest moments of relief. Women concealed their visits, endured their guilt, and returned again and again to the cycle of secrecy and dependence. Their lives became a continuous loop of indulgence and denial, a contradiction sustained by silence. It was a loop that served the needs of society, but it tore at the souls of those trapped within it. And as the cycle deepened, it began to undermine something else: the authority of men who believed themselves firmly in control of their households. Victorian men lived with the confidence that their authority was unquestioned, both in their households and in society at large. Husbands viewed themselves as guardians of morality, protectors of fragile wives,